Hi, we continue in 2 Samuel 7 today after Nathan has first told David, do whatever is in your heart, and then that night Yahweh came to Nathan with a speech to tell David, which we're in the process of hearing. We listened last time to chapter 7 verses 1 to 7, and now we're going to pick up here and go 8 through 11, which will finish the first chiasm in the chapter. If you haven't been following us, we've been looking, as you can see on the right side of the screen, to the various acts beginning in chapter 5, verse 6, that show David's consolidation of the legitimacy of his royal reign in these chapters. And I won't go over all these now, I went over them last time, but here we're in this section here, an assertion of Yahweh's superior authority to which David acknowledges being subject, as we'll see. And one of the interesting aspects of this, which I looked at last time, and again, I won't go over it in detail now, but just to draw to your attention, is it's unclear whether we're looking at a pro-David or anti-David voice, a pro-monarchy or anti-monarchy voice, a pro-temple or anti-temple voice, because it's very ambiguous. And as I've been noting, this chapter in particular, although this whole unit really is the case, is unusual, in fact unique in ancient literature, where kings just simply took for granted that their gods were on their side, at least in art and propaganda, in royal things like the Enuma Elish in the Babylonian story or in the Egyptian stories. It's just a given that the king is an incarnation or is supported by their local gods, and therefore the temple, where the gods live, is right next to the palace. But in our story, we see Yahweh making that a question rather than an assumption. And that's really insightful on the part of the ancient audience to highlight that although David may well be doing Yahweh's will, it's Yahweh who's doing the directing. It's Yahweh who's in charge of this whole thing. It's not really David at all, but it's really Yahweh working through David. Although David has free will, and we'll see him make some choices, whether they're pro-Yahweh or pro-Israel or not, you'll have to decide for yourself. But that's where we are. And David hasn't said a word yet. We're just now taking this pause as Yahweh's continuing to speak to Nathan, and continues here in verse 8. And we've been looking also at the key words, and we're in this section here from this now therefore to right up to this section, and we can see the people of Israel are key here. My people Israel, 3 times here. And what's really interesting, if we were to read this section not knowing that this had been about the temple, starting in verse 8, we'd never know, because there's nothing about the temple here. And in fact, after, as we saw last time, that Yahweh objected with a double rhetorical question, did I ever speak a word saying, why have you not built me a house of cedar? This rhetorical question challenged by this rhetorical question. That's the last we hear of it. Now Yahweh will turn to David and say what Yahweh has done and what Yahweh will do, not just for David, but for Israel. So as we enter into it, let's continue to observe the chiastic patterns that we saw. We're in the middle of this one here, starting in verse 8, but we also looked at this one, this little tight one for over 3 verses there, and now we're also continuing in this one here, starting right here as part of this chiasm. And the fact that there are so many overlapping and nested chiasms highlights the back and forth nature here, as Yahweh speaks and then David responds, and we'll see down here with David's response how similar the chiastic shape is here with what we see up here. So I'll put the key words up and we'll just jump right in starting in verse 8. So as I noted earlier, where Rosenberg helped us to hear the layers of quotation within what the narrator is telling us that Yahweh said to Nathan, and Nathan is to tell to David, we see a similar thing here. Note what we hear in terms of quotation in this verse. So this is Yahweh speaking to Nathan. Now therefore, thus you, Nathan, shall say to my servant David, thus says the Lord. So this is Yahweh telling Nathan to quote Yahweh, quoting Yahweh. Thus says the Lord is quoting Yahweh, telling him to quote Yahweh here, which isn't an exact quote, but it's in a quote from within this. It's not a previous quote, but it's a quote from within the vision there. So part of the point being many levels of quotation leading back to Yahweh here. And one of the questions in this whole unit is, why does Nathan need to be here as the intermediary? He has no role whatsoever other than to receive this word and to relay it. And we hear him receive it, but we simply hear the narrator's response that Nathan told all these words to David. Perhaps it's to set up Nathan's authority for what we'll see in chapters 11 and 12 around the Bathsheba and Uriah incident, so that Nathan doesn't come to us out of nowhere. Because in this chapter, he has no role at all other than to tell David, wrongly, do whatever is in your heart. So now, therefore, va'ata, indicating a shift in topic, as we'll see also in later in the chapter. Thus you shall say to my servant David. And as we noted earlier in this chapter, my servant David, within the quote, Yahweh refers Nathan to refer to my servant David. And as we noted earlier, only Abraham and Moses are otherwise referred to as Yahweh's servant, and 13 of the 20 uses of servant with a person connected to it are about David. So this is the second time in our immediate passage, as we can see here. So thus says the Yahweh of hosts, using the military image of Yahweh, I took you from the pasture, from following the sheep, to be Nagid over my people Israel. Let's look at this more carefully. So it starts off talking that Yahweh took David from the pasture, highlighting that it was Yahweh's idea from the very beginning, that it wasn't David's idea. David wasn't applying for the job of king, as we recall, but it was Yahweh's idea. It says, thus says Yahweh of hosts, using the military image of God, I took you from the pasture. Again, at 1525, where we see here, it's hidden in the translation, carry the ark of God back into the city if I find favor in the eyes of Yahweh. This is David speaking to Zadok in the midst of Absalom's starting his rebellion. He will bring me back and let me see both it and the place where it stays, which is the pasture here. As my note below there says, an apparently bizarre designation for Jerusalem or the temple, but we'll see what that's about when we get to chapter 15. So I took you from the pasture, from following the sheep, or from behind the sheep, to be Nagid over my people Israel. And we've seen Nagid a couple of times, and we've noted that Nagid, although this translation prints makes it sound like it's lesser than king, throughout is a sacred title for God's anointed one, in contrast with king, which is a word used by any leader in any of the empires in the area. So this is almost certainly the more sacred word for what Yahweh has chosen David to be Nagid over my people Israel. And this is where the focus is on what David is doing for Israel, not what David could do for Yahweh or what Yahweh's even doing for David, but that Yahweh's primary role is to guard the people Israel, and David is simply a function of that task. And so as part of that, Yahweh continues, and I have been with you wherever you went, and have cut off all your enemies from before you. As Falkman suggests, his phase as roaming warlord is a continuation of the Exodus, because Yahweh is described as being with the people throughout the wilderness, both in the Exodus story and then in Moses' retelling of it in Deuteronomy. And it's one of many examples in this passage, as we saw just a few verses earlier when Yahweh said, I've never lived in a tent or a tabernacle since I brought you up out of Egypt. So the Exodus story is certainly in the background here, as is the Judges story, as we'll see just a couple of verses down. A rare thing in the books of Samuel, but certainly a suggestion of later composition of this chapter. And perhaps this whole unit of 5 to 7 that we've been looking at. So I've been with you wherever you went, and cut off, using, interesting, the word for cutting a covenant, karet here, usually the word for going with a covenant, but not here. As Gilmore notes below, here and with I will make, there is much Hebrew grammatical debate. Is this future or past, the cut off? So it will cut off your enemies or have cut off your enemies, and there's no clear answer to that here. We heard in verse 1, the narrator said, I'll give you rest from your enemies, so this is confirming the narrator's accuracy there. And then I will make for you a great name like the names of the great ones on the earth. And maybe you hear, like me, something about the call of Abram back in Genesis 12, as we see here, but also the Tower of Babel story, people wanting to make their name great. And there we saw all the people of the earth gathered in the plain of Shinar and built the tower so their name collectively would be made great. But this is the individual name of David that Yahweh says will be made great. Let's look at it a little more closely. The great name here, Gadol Kashem, we see it that phrase a number of times in Jeremiah and Malachi for Yahweh, for Elohim, but not for a person here. But we see it in a psalm, and we see it in the revision in Chronicles. As my note has, thus the promises to Abraham and to David echo each other, and here contrast with David's own attempt to make his name great, as we'll see later. But there's also an echo as we look further at this phrase, which you notice he doesn't show, I will make you a great name like the name of the great ones of the earth. It's much more parallel, we can see in the Hebrew here. Shem Gadol here, Kashem Hagadolim. So make a name great and make many names great here. We don't know who these are, but presumably it refers to other kings, and so David will have a great name like other kings. But why would Yahweh want to make David's name great? That's an interesting question that's left out there, and that certainly suggests a pro-David audience, or a pro-David author here, someone who would approve of the idea of David's name being raised up and attributing that to Yahweh. But now it stops talking about David altogether and returns to Israel. And I will appoint a place for my people Israel, and I will plant them. And there's much going on here to look at. As Polza notes, note the verbs of stability, contrasting with David as shepherd. Appoint a place, plant, live in their own place, not be disturbed, give rest. And as Esslinger notes, there are promises for David too, but they are set in a structural context that aims to remind David that he and his position are literally peripheral to Israel's fortune as the covenant people. And that's what I was just noting above, that David's role from Yahweh is to help lead the people Israel, which Yahweh will do these things to. We need to look a little more closely at the words. I will appoint, literally, I will set, different from the word translated I appoint here. Don't know why they do that kind of thing. As the two words for place are two different words here. So the translation is very misleading about the Hebrew. This word place is makom, the standard word for place, echoing Deuteronomy 16, where the place where Yahweh will put his name is where you're supposed to go to celebrate all the festivals. Plainly from Deuteronomy's perspective, that's Jerusalem. But there's much more going on, and we have to look closely at that. And I will plant them. Interesting vision of Israel as a seed or a fledgling plant that we put in the ground rather permanently. And we can see from these two quotes here from Exodus and Amos, the last word in Amos, the very similar image. Amos is an 8th century prophet, and depending upon when you think Exodus was written, my argument has been, and Come Out My People and elsewhere, roughly in the 9th century, sometime after the reign of Solomon, as a counterstory to justify the reign of Jeroboam as king in Israel over against the Judahite perspective that Jeroboam committed sins for leading people away from Jerusalem. So if that's the case, that Exodus is from the 9th century and Amos is from the 8th century, and our author knows these verses that are echoed here, both in the sense of recalling the goal of the Exodus, not just the language, but of Amos calling people back after the Assyrians destroyed Israel in the north, not the exile of the Judahites in Babylon a century later, that this is a common image for God as the gardener, something we hear in John 15, I am the vine and you are the branches, and my Father is the gardener, that we see here. I will plant them. It's also similar to the image, not using the same language, from Isaiah 5 about a song for God's vineyard, which also echoes into the Gospels. So this idea of Israel as something planted in the ground, getting nourishment from the land, very different than who Yahweh is, moving all around, so that they may live in their own place. Before we saw the word often translated live as the word for settled here, and I translated that consistently. But here as live is a different word, shocking here, only here in Samuel, but 132 times in the Masoretic text. And why the variation, I couldn't say. There's not a nuance of that word that really makes clear that I could see why the difference. But this in their own place is not makom here. It's tachath here, and the root meaning means below or under, which is how it's used otherwise, both in these places. I won't go to them there because they're not directly relevant. So it doesn't literally mean place. Perhaps it can be translated using this here, that they will live under, in the sense of being planted under Yahweh's rule from above, but it's not clear, as the Hebrew often is not. The English translation makes it sound more clear than it is. And be disturbed no more, literally shaken. It's not the same word for the ark shaken that cost Uzzah his life when the oxen shook the ark, but it's similar to other shaking that we saw earlier of enemies that led them to want to have a king. So Yahweh promising that with David, Yahweh will make sure they will be disturbed no more, although it will happen. It's not that they won't be disturbed anymore. Obviously, there's going to be an exile, which is pretty much a disturbance or a shaking, as we'll see. But that's the word we hear from Yahweh to Nathan to David. And evildoers, or literally sons of injustice, B'nai Avalah here, only one other time in the Deuteronomistic history or in Torah, although 34 times in the Masoretic text, mostly in Psalms and Job, which also suggest a later providence. Psalms and Job, certainly the collection of Psalms being later, some of them are earlier, but Job is certainly an exilic or post-exilic text, as most scholars agree. So there are many hints here that the language may suggest a later composition. Shall afflict them, in the PL, Anathov here, which is the word for Tamar's being raped by Amnon 4 times in chapter 13, suggesting not being shaken anymore, which can be like an earthquake or like an invasion, or not being raped here, which again suggests being entered involuntarily with violence. So could be metaphorical for being raped as if being invaded, like the exile. And yet the promise is it's no more, and yet will happen. The contrast here, though, is between as formerly from the time I appointed judges. And that's, of course, the argument that we see at the end of Judges. Everybody did what was right in their own eyes. There was no king in Israel. And so the period of the judges ended in chaos, especially after the horrible rape scene of the Levite concubine that ended up with a large destruction of the people of Benjamin. So the time of Judges had some successes, but they've certainly been disturbed and been afflicted. And now the promise is that will not happen, that something about having David will change that. Falkman, reading this as he does, purely in a literary perspective, doesn't ask the kinds of questions that I'm dancing around about time of composition, and just reads it straight through like the audience knows all the books that came before it. And I won't read this quote here. You can pause on it if you'd like to read it. But to highlight the difference in reading, if you read the Bible from Genesis all the way to 2 Samuel, as if the audience knows everything there, rather than trying to sort it out the best one can from the language and the echoes and sorting them into some kind of order, if not a final one. So, continuing here into our last verse for today. From the time that I appointed judges, literally charged or commanded. This word does not mean appointed. It's what we saw in verse 7 above in the amidst the two rhetorical questions where it's translated command, just a few verses before. So, for a time that I commanded judges over my people Israel. So the point isn't that they were appointed. The point is they're operating under Yahweh's oversight, as David is to operate as well. The word for judges, shofet, here is 62 times in the Deuteronomistic history, but in 2 Samuel it's only here and in 15:4 where Absalom appeals to it in his own heart. If only I were a judge, people could come to me and I would give them justice. So that was certainly the hope for judges, and we see it again in the undergoing Absalom's rebellion. And notice how the story is filling in a brief history here from the Exodus through the time of the judges to the monarchy. So from the time I appointed judges over my people Israel, the third time in our little passage here, as you can see, and I will give you rest from all your enemies. Notice here it's future tense. Its framing was 7:1, but here it's future tense, and it omits what we heard in verse 1, all around, and clearly making a future reference. As my note below has here from Falkman, from time immemorial and through the entire period of the judges until now, there was unrest and oppression. Only now, at the coming of David, will the blows of tyranny and crises cease, and the nation, unified under one crown, receive the rest which makes putting down roots really possible. And Falkman isn't saying that because he believes that the entire period of judges was one of unrest and oppression. He's simply saying that's what the narrative is telling us, which is highlighting, as I've been looking here, that this whole purpose of this is to justify why David gets to be king. And it's highlighting in Yahweh's voice that Yahweh is doing all the things that Israel wanted a king for through David, and therefore they should be grateful and accept the idea that David is ruling in Yahweh's name. But it's not quite over. Now it turns back to make a play on the initial question. Moreover, and as my note from Schweinewine has below, the Hebrew might be construed to mean Yahweh declares to you that he, i.e. David's son, will establish a house for you, O Yahweh. In fact, this is how the Septuagint translators rendered the Hebrew. But here's how we hear it in the ORSV. Yahweh declares to you that Yahweh will make you a house. So, as Schwindewind is suggesting, this could be construed to suggest that Solomon will make you a house, which is what we'll see in the next unit here. We'll look at next video here, where it suddenly turns to the issue of establishment and Solomon. But here, it's making a lovely wordplay on house. David implicitly proposed to make build a house for Yahweh. Yahweh refusing to use the word build, but using ya'asah for make, as Falkman notes, stands outside the much-discussed plane of I build, you build, and the material object which goes with it, that is a house. He had already mockingly turned around on such building in the envelope of the oracle refusal, which is, say, the chiasm of the first part that we saw. So now it says, we'll make you a house. And as you can see here, and as I posted on the cover of this video, meaning the dynasty of David. But here, so far, we don't hear anything about whether that will be on the throne or whether it will last for a long time. Simply, Yahweh is saying that David will thrive and he'll be a house. But does that mean he'll be a royal dynasty? We'll have to wait for next time to see that. See you then. Bye-bye.